Hello, and welcome to my weekly podcast and video, Through the Bible in 10 Years. Today, we're going to continue in Hebrews chapter 1, and we're going to do verses 5 through 14. These verses are sometimes called the catena of Hebrews 1, a chain of quotations from the Old Testament. Sometimes this passage is likened to some of the collections of scriptures in the Dead Sea Scrolls, 4Q Florilegia, uh, 4Q Testimonium. These are Dead Sea fragments that basically are a collection of scriptures on a particular topic. And so I think that Hebrews is more majestic than those two examples and a more coherent argument. Those feel a little bit more kind of strung together. The artistry of Hebrews 1, 5 through 14, I think, is spectacular, incredibly artful. And we'll see in a second. To me, the the beginning, Hebrews 1 is kind of like the beginning of Star Wars music. Dun da da dun da 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 dun da 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 dun 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 dun. Jesus is Christ, or in this case, probably more Son of God. But it's a majestic, almost hymnic, I would say, celebration of the enthroned Christ. We'll get to that in a minute. So let's let's remind ourselves a little bit of the context of this chain of quotations in which Jesus is declared greatly superior to the angels. So the first four verses of Hebrews are sometimes called the exordium or the proimium of Hebrews. You might call it a sermon introduction, although we'll talk about whether Hebrews is a sermon at the end of this series. But Hebrews certainly doesn't seem to be just a run-of-the-mill letter. It doesn't have a letter opening, and it has an incredibly artful opening. Those first four verses, very wonderful Greek. And it ends with verse 4. Let's go back to verse 3. Having made a purification for sins, he sat down on the right hand of majesty in the heights. And if you're watching the video version, I have interlinearbible.org up. And verse 4 says, having become by as much greater than the angels as a more excellent name he has inherited than them. Now, notice the timing here. He sat on the right hand of God, having inherited a name. The most natural way to take this is that the timing of him inheriting this name is when he sits on the right hand of God. I would say, among others, G.B. Caird said this a long, long time ago, that it is really easy to read Nicaea into Hebrews chapter 1, to read Trinitarian ideas, to read basically later orthodoxy into Hebrews 1. I am not in any way accusing Hebrews of being unorthodox. That's not my point. I might say, I'm not even going to say that Hebrews 1 is pre-orthodox. I want to say that Hebrews simply is not addressing the questions or categories of Nicaea. It's just not what it's talking about. It's not that Hebrews 1 contradicts those. That's not the point either. The point is that Hebrews is doing early New Testament Christology, which was not yet at Nicaea. There is a fair amount of scholarship today, I would say, that is anachronistic, that in a postmodern, post-liberal context, it has become acceptable to shove Nicaea down the throat of Hebrews 1. But we've got, and that's okay if we're reading Hebrews 1 theologically. But if we're being exegetical with Hebrews 1, that is, if we're asking what are the most likely readings of the author of Hebrews and the audience of Hebrews in the first century, how would they have understood this? How would they have tended it? We've got to bracket Nicaea. We've got to leave Nicaea in the 300s, because remember, even in the 300s, Nicaea was debatable. We have to listen, or debated, that is. So we need to listen to this text if we're talking, or what it actually meant, what it really meant, not what we want it to mean, not what the church has read it in the past. And let me say here, the patristic exegesis is good theology. It is rarely good exegesis. we don't read the church fathers from a historical standpoint. We don't read the church fathers to get insight on what the text actually meant. We read the text, the church fathers, to know how the Holy Spirit was leading later church fathers to process these texts in the light of Orthodox concerns. Okay, those there's my little aside there. So if we're disciplined and we listen to the text and let it say what it seems to say, what does it say? It says that he made a purification for sins. It says he sat down on the right hand of majesty in the heights. And then it says he inherited a name greater than the angels. So the timing here, the burden of proof is on anyone who would say the timing here, the timing of the name and the timing of the name greater than the angels is not at the enthronement of Jesus at God's right hand. That's where the context is pushing us. When we mentioned last week this question of what is the name? What is the name that he inherits? Of course, it's very tempting to think that the name is Yahweh, although I haven't entirely made sense of what that would mean for Jesus to inherit the name Yahweh at the time of his enthronement. Nevertheless, Richard Balcom has convinced me that there were probably some early Christians who interpreted his enthronement in that way, that Jesus inherits the name Yahweh when he sits at God's right hand. However, as I've mulled over this, and last week when I did the podcast, I said I'm going to leave myself open to changing my mind on what the name is. But I had a false start doing the podcast video this week. I used my microphone, and somehow I didn't have my microphone on. So you've lost 37 minutes of glory, and I'm having to re-record this. But the second time's a charm. In fact, maybe it'll be better the second time around because I've already had a rehearsal. As I went through the text in doing the podcast, the first failed attempt, I just have to conclude that the name is Son. And remember that the word name, it's natural for us to read words the way we read words. And so Son doesn't seem like a name to me, but that's my world. And of course, when we're doing exegesis, it really doesn't matter what my world is. It matters what their world was. And in their world, the word for name, onoma, could mean title as well. So he has inherited a title or an office that is as much greater than them as the name that he has inherited. And that name, I think, is Son of God. The reason I think that as I went through this again is because we have Son in the beginning of verse 5. We have Son in the second part of verse 5. We have firstborn Son in verse 6. We have God in verse 8. The word Lord, Yahweh, Lord is the Greek translation of Yahweh typically. We don't have Lord till verse 10. And so if Lord is the name that he inherited, it sure takes Hebrews a long time to get there. And so, it's possible that they knew. I mean, this text was not written to me. It was not written to you. It was not written to anybody alive today. As scripture, it's for us, but it was not written to us. And so it may very well be that the audience of Hebrews would have immediately known, he's talking about Yahweh, in which case my argument, doesn't matter. But we don't have that evidence. The only evidence I have to go on is what the text actually says. And given what the text actually says, I have to still go with Son of God as being the name that he's inherited, the title that he's inherited, the office that he's inherited, that is as much greater than the angels, as his name is greater than theirs. So that's the lead off to the catena, to the chain of quotations that begins with verse 5. Okay, so let's actually go into the text that we're looking at today. I hope I can write this up this week. I thought I'm going to go to Hebrews because I have enough of my interpretation on the tip of my brain, and I've done enough spade work here, and I've written down some of it, that surely I can crank out my explanatory notes on Hebrews 1, and as I go through it. Well, let's, for me, I'm praying that I can get through that in my blog, before next Sunday when we go into Hebrews chapter 2. We'll see what happens. But verse 5, for to which of the angels at some time has he said, quote, my son are you, I today have birthed you. This is, of course, a quote from Psalm 2:7, and it is Psalm 2 is a enthronement psalm, I would say. It's a royal psalm. Um, a lot of these psalms were read spiritually by the early Christians, and so they became what we might call messianic psalms. There probably are some who would say, well, that's all they ever were. But it would be kind of peculiar for Israel, to have these psalms. It's like, wow, this psalm doesn't apply to anything now, but one day this psalm will make sense. I think that's simply not the case. And when we get to Psalm 45, a little bit later, you'll see Jesus didn't have a wife and he didn't have children. So it's quite clear that this is the problem of exegesis, that we are prone to read these in our own categories or with our own theological preconceptions, and therefore become incompetent at reading them in context. These were royal psalms to begin with. They applied to the king of Judah. I doubt the king of Israel in the north, probably just the king of Judah, I would guess. They applied to the king of Judah, at least the king, in their original context. And so Psalm 2 was likely an enthronement psalm. The king is becoming the Son of God on the day of the king's enthronement. God, as it were, Yahweh is giving birth to the king as his son, as the king is being coronated, as the king is being anointed, as the king is being enthroned. And so there is this, in other words, this fits very well with the context of Jesus' exaltation, that as Jesus sits at God's right hand, as he assumes the office of king, God is giving him birth as the Son of God. Now, does that mean that Jesus wasn't the Son of God before his enthronement? I don't think it necessarily means that. Prince William in England will probably one day be king. He has not been crowned. So he is not the king in power yet. By the way, there's a host of New Testament passages that corroborate this reading. And the one that I just alluded to is Romans 1:3. He, having come of the seed of David according to the flesh, and appointed Son of God in power by the resurrection of the dead. Again, notice in Paul, by the resurrection of the dead, Jesus is declared or appointed Son of God in power. The timing is very consistent in the book of Acts, it's consistent in Paul, and it's consistent here in Hebrews, that Jesus assumes the office of Son of God, of Christ, Messiah, of Lord, that the focal point of his assumption of that role is when he is exalted to God's right hand, seated and enthroned. That is the locus of the meaning of those expressions. That doesn't mean we can't call Jesus Messiah before then. It doesn't mean that we can't call him Son of God before then. It doesn't mean that we can't call him Lord before them. We could find examples of that as well. But I'm saying that the focal meaning of those terms, Lord, Christ, Son of God, in Paul, in Acts, in Hebrews, is at the enthronement. Long ago, James D.G. Dunn did an excellent job of showing this in his book, Christology in the Making. So if you look at Acts 13:33, very similar. He is exalted to God's right hand, and he is Son of God. And so we're going to find this in various places in the New Testament. So I've already mentioned Romans 1:3 and Acts 13:33 as places where the phrase Son of God is located primarily in relation to his exaltation. In Acts 2:35, we find the same thing with regard to the phrase Lord and the phrase Christ. Again, in Acts 2, Peter is giving the Pentecost sermon. He talks about how God raised Jesus from the dead, and what comes? Therefore, let Israel be assured that God has made this Jesus, whom you crucified, both Lord and Christ. What's the timing? The timing is resurrection, made Lord and Christ. We find this in the Philippian hymn, Philippians chapter 2. He became obedient unto death, even death on a cross. Therefore, God has highly exalted him and give him a name above every name, that every knee should bow and tongue confess that Jesus Christ is Lord. Therefore, he is given the name Jesus Christ is Lord. He is Lord, he is Lord, He is risen from the dead and he is Lord. Again, it's all over Paul. It's all over Acts. It's all over Hebrews, Romans 10:9. If we confess with our mouth that Jesus is Lord and believe in our hearts that God raised him from the dead, you see again the connection between his lordship and his resurrection. Tradition, again, I believe in Nicaea. I believe that Jesus eternally begotten of the Father, begotten, not made. I believe all those things. That's what God led the church to tie it all together, bring it all together. But as an exegete, it's anachronistic to read those interpretations back into the New Testament. Exegetic, if we're disciplined, if we disciplined ourselves and we're really interested in what's true and what the evidence points to, I don't even think this is ambiguous. Throughout the New Testament, it's clear in Paul and Acts and Hebrews that the locus of Jesus' sonship, of his lordship, of his messiahship is the resurrection, exaltation, enthronement of Jesus. He's the heir apparent prior to that point, but he assumes the role of king when he sits at God's right hand. And here we again have to remember that the phrase Son of God is a royal expression. It has to do with being the king. The king is God's representative on earth. The king is a son of God. This is a very common ancient Near Eastern category, and very well known. In fact, we see it in the second. Let me go on to the rest of this verse. And again, I will make him a father. I will be to him a father, and he himself will be to me a son. If we go back to 2 Samuel 7:14 and we look at the original context of this quote, what is it? It's David praying about Solomon. And God says, I will be Solomon's father and Solomon will be my son. So again, this is not even ambiguous in the slightest. If we are disciplined exegetically, I don't think we'll come to any other conclusion. Now, J.B. Lightfoot was an incredible scholar in the late 1800s, but he was not disciplined. He read his Orthodox theology. Again, nothing wrong with Orthodox theology. It's just still in process. Not that this doesn't contradict Orthodox theology. It's just not what the author of Hebrews is talking about. And so Son of God here is a royal epithet. It is a royal title. And the location of verse 5 is not the eternal begettingness of Jesus in the context. It's simple. There are no clues whatsoever in the context to that extent. Why am I'm getting a little riled up here because I've been raked over the coals for the last 15, 20 years for this position, but it's not ambiguous. It is the disciplined reading of this passage. To come up with anything else, you have to shove later theology down the throat of this verse. That is my opinion. Again, I could be wrong, but I've spent a lot of time trying to be disciplined, trying to listen to the text, trying to bracket out my theology and listen to this text exegetically, which means listening to it in its literary and historical context. And I just don't think it's not a question. He sits at God's right hand. He is enthroned as king. He is enthroned as Lord. He is enthroned as Christ, as anointed one. He is enthroned as the Son of God at God's right hand, and he assumes the role of Lord and Messiah and Son of God. He has inherited a name. The angels are servants, as verse 14 will say. They are ministering servants sent for those who are about to inherit salvation. They are servants. He is the king, and they all must bow down before him, as we'll see in verse 8. And so, dun, da, 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 he is the Son of God. He is the Son of God. He is the Son of God. Dun, dun, dun. So this is a celebration of the enthroned Son of God, Jesus, at God's right hand. For to which of the angels has he said, you are my son, I today have given you birth, and again, I will be your father, and he will be my son. Well, that's just the first verse of the Catena. Isn't this wonderful? Spectacular celebration of Jesus here. Verse 6, and again, whenever he leads the firstborn son into the inhabited world, he says, and let all the angels of God worship him or bow down before him. This is a somewhat difficult verse to interpret. I've written a couple articles and of course engaged this text in books as well that I've written, and I spent some time. I spent some time. I used to run 5 miles in Durham, England. And while I would run, I would mull over these exegetical issues. What does this mean? What does this mean? What does this mean? 5 miles. What does this mean? What does this mean? Come back and probably not have any better sense of it. And then, of course, eventually you write stuff and you have to make a decision. You have to fall off the log. I feel comfortable with my interpretation of verse 6, but it's a difficult. I'll admit it's a difficult verse to place in some respects. There are three main interpretations of verse 6. It all falls on the again. What does the again here go with? Whenever again he leads his firstborn son into the world. Well, so interpretation number one, I hear angels, I hear firstborn son, I hear worship. Hey, this is angels we have heard on high. Glory to God in the highest. This is the birth scene in Luke, and that's where our minds often would go to think that this is talking about when Jesus was incarnated, when Jesus came to earth, when Jesus was baby Jesus in the manger in Bethlehem. That is a natural way to read this if we read it through the eyes of Luke. Now, was Luke written at the time of Hebrews? I don't think so. Did the author of Hebrews know Luke 2? I don't know. I don't know. I doubt it, but it's possible. It is possible. I mean, I don't think Luke was written, but he may know the story in a raw form before it reached a written form. It's possible. So we have to put that as one. Now, again, what is the discipline of exegesis? The discipline of exegesis is bracketing out information that the author may or may not know or may not engage. And so I have to be careful about reading Luke here because this may not be talking about Luke at all. But I get it. It sounds a lot like Luke 2. And so it's very tempting to date it there. What if the again goes with he brings him again into the world? Well, then it could possibly be about the second coming. He leads him again to his firstborn into the world at the second time. Hebrews, by the way, Hebrews 9 is where the idea of a second coming comes from. And he will come a second time. So this could be about the second coming. That's the second possible interpretation. What makes this tempting exegetically is the fact that the scripture being quoted here is Deuteronomy 32:43, which is the Song of Moses. And the context of this verse in the Song of Moses is judgment. And so that would make sense of the second coming. So that's a possibility. When I eventually fell off the log here, there are a couple things that convinced me to go with the third interpretation, and that is that this is talking about the entrance of Jesus into heaven when he is exalted and seated at God's right hand. Again, I'm not as confident about my interpretation of verse 6 as I am of my interpretation of verse 5, but I feel pretty good about it. So to read it that way, Jesus has made a purification for sins. He has ascended into heaven. He is exalted at God's right hand. He is seated at God's right hand, and all the angels bow down in worship as the Son of God is enthroned, as the King has arrived. All the servants bow because the King is here. And so a couple things about this. First of all, we have to take the word for inhabited world or civilized world, oikumene, get the word economy from it. We have to take that, if in this interpretation, we have to take that as basically saying that the heavenly realm is the truly inhabited world and that the earthly realm is not the truly inhabited world. Do I have any evidence for this? Well, I do a little from chapter 2, I think it's verse 5, where it says that Hebrews has been talking about the coming inhabited world. And so if that is a reference, again, to the heavenly realm, then we would have supporting, because Hebrews 2:5 seems to indicate that when it talks about the world in this context, the oikumene, it's not talking about the earthly world. It's talking about a different world. It's talking about a world to come. And so there's a little bit of evidence. The thing I think that convinced me the most is the literary structure of these three quotes. He says, and again, because in chapter 2, we find that threefold chain of quotes in chapter 2 as well. He says, and again, and again. And so if you take that pattern, he says, first quote, and again, second quote, and again, third quote. And so when you take it that way, that the again is basically connecting verse 6. And remember, the verse divisions were added in the 1500s. Verse 6, therefore, is the third in a series of quotes that starts at the beginning of verse 5, which would, again, it would tie verse 6 with verse 5, and therefore imply that the context is the same as verse 5. So I'm going to go with interpretation number 3, that it's saying that when he leads his firstborn son of God, again, listen to the text, don't shove your theology in it. Listening to the text, the firstborn son is the Son of God, enthroned at God's right hand. And so he leads Jesus into the throne room as the king. He is seated and enthroned as king, as Son of God, and all the angels bow down before him. All the angels worship him. They bow down before him as he is enthroned as king. This is brilliant imagery, brilliant theology, deeply profound. And I think we miss it because we've got so much Nicaea in our ears that we can't listen to what the text actually seems to be saying. The quote here, Deuteronomy 32:43, is an interesting quote. If you go to most Bibles, if you have the NIV and you go back to Deuteronomy 32:43, you're not going to find anything like this. It's a great textual question because it doesn't match the Hebrew text as we know it. Now, the Septuagint, the Greek Old Testament, has let the sons of God worship him, which angels were understood to be sons of God. So that fits. I personally suspect that the Septuagint in this case gives us a more original version of the Old Testament. There is textual criticism of the Old Testament, like the New Testament. We just don't have as much to go by. But this is an instance where I think the Masoretic text has it wrong. Probably some copyist at some point felt uncomfortable talking about the sons of God and eliminated it. Could be some other reason why it was eliminated. The phrase angels of God is not attested, as far as I can remember, at the time of Christ. It does appear later in a Christian work known as the Odes, but who's to say which came first, Hebrews or the Odes? But sons of God is what it probably said in the original Hebrew of the Old Testament. Very interesting conundrum here. It's a conundrum for King James only people because both can't be correct originally in terms of the King James. King James, Deuteronomy 32:43, is it right in Deuteronomy or is it right here in Hebrews? It basically says the King James version has to be wrong at one point. It can't be right at both points. Of course, when you're going for the original, it doesn't matter what a translation does. The original fit. Well, I'm not going to get off on that tangent. But anyway, very interesting textual issues here with regard to Hebrews 6. And it's possible that the author of Hebrews himself changed sons of God to angels of God. That the author of Hebrews himself may be doing a little message translate or an NLT version here, where he's paraphrasing sons of God as angels. That's possible. Although there are those who would say that Hebrews is much more. Is it Susan Doherty? That she seems to think that Hebrews was pretty strict in its following of the biblical text. I don't know whether I'm convinced of that, but anyway, I think she makes a case that it's possible that Hebrews was strict in its quoting the Old Testament. I don't think she makes a case that it's definitive that Hebrews was strict in its quoting of Old Testament passages. Well, some tangents there. We go on to verse 7. So verses 5 and 6 go together as a he says and again and again. Quote number 1, quote number 2, quote number 3. So when we get to verse 7, we have the second block of quotations. And we are assisted here in the Greek by what's called a men de construction. Verse 7 has the word men in it, and verse 8 has the word de in it. And that suggests that verse 7 is a on the one hand, and verses 8 through 12 are on the other hand. So verse 7 is contrasted with the next two quotations. So you have on the one hand, this is true of the angels, but on the other hand, this quote and this quote are true in relation to Jesus. So that's the structure of verses 7 through 12. So let's go ahead and look at verse 7. And on the one hand, to the angels, he says, quote, the one who makes his angels spirits and his ministers a flame of fire. So this is a big, kind of a bizarre thing to quote from one of the Psalms. But in fact, Hebrews seems to flip it. The Psalm seems to be saying he makes the winds his messengers, and he makes a flame of fire his servant, something like that. Hebrews flips it. The one who makes his messengers winds and his servants a flame of fire. Of course, as I've already mentioned, verse 14, which says, aren't the angels ministering spirits sent to those who are about to inherit salvation? So if we ask, well, what did the author of Hebrews want the audience to take from verse 7? I think there are two things that the author of Hebrews wanted the audience to take from verse 7. One is that the angels are servants, they're ministers, as opposed to Jesus, who is the King, who is the Son of God, who is the Lord. And so that's a point of contrast. Their servants, he's King. Their servants, he's God. Their servants, he's Lord. So that's one point of contrast. Their servants, he's royalty. The second point of contrast, I think, has to do with the temporary service, the temporary nature of the service of the angels, the transitory nature of the service of the angels versus the permanence of Jesus' ministry. So winds blow and they're gone. Flames of fire flicker. Say that 10 times fast. Flames of fire flicker. And then they disappear. But they are, what does verse 14 say again? They are ministering spirits sent to those about to inherit salvation. Well, we're about to inherit salvation. And once we inherit salvation, well, that job's done. I mean, the angels, I'm sure there'll be plenty of jobs for the angels to do after we've inherited salvation. But, once we've inherited salvation, their ministering role is over. Close that one down. That task force is over. And so their role in relation to humanity is temporary. But Jesus' role in relation to humanity is permanent. And so when we get to these two quotes, the first quote is in verses 8 and 9, gives us the first quote that contrasts Jesus with the angels. And this is from Psalm 45. Verse 8, let me read verse 8 and 9. So on the one hand, he says to the angels this, but on the other hand, to the Son, he says, your throne, O God, is forever and ever, and the staff of straightness is the staff of your kingdom. You loved righteousness and hated lawlessness. On account of this, God, your God, has anointed you with oil of exaltation in the presence of your companions. Okay, so this is fantastical. Jesus is flat out called God. Although, let's go back to Psalm 45. What is Psalm 45? I've already mentioned Psalm 45. It's a wedding psalm. It's quite clear it's a wedding psalm, and that it was a psalm that was originally in relation to the wedding of an earthly king. There is a bride, the queen, who is coming in, who's decked in great opulence, and behind her are her virgin companions, or concubines, and so forth, her attendants, her maidens, maybe not concubines. Let's not even go there. But this was a wedding psalm. Now, of course, what's interesting in Psalm 45 is that human earthly king is flat out called God. Your throne, O God, is forever and ever. Perhaps talking about the dynasty, of course. Again, we have to distinguish the first meaning from a spiritual meaning, or the first meaning from a fuller sense, a sensus plenior, the original context meaning in ancient Israel, and the reverberations that those texts had when the early Christians looked at them with spiritual eyes. There's no contradiction, because words are by nature polyvalent. They can have multiple meanings. And so it's perfectly allowed for the Holy Spirit to inspire the early Christians to see fuller spiritual meanings in these texts that had an original meaning in ancient Israel. But in ancient Israel, this is a wedding psalm. And I think it's quite clear if we listen to the text. Again, we don't like listening to the text sometimes. We get uncomfortable and we think, no, it can't mean that. I have to fiddle with it. I have to make it mean something else. But it seems very clear that Psalm 45 originally referred to the earthly king as God. And this makes us uncomfortable. But of course, it doesn't mean literally. It's a figurative sense. The earthly king was figuratively like God. You know, what does God say to Moses? I will make you like God to Pharaoh, God says in Exodus. The earthly king is the son of God. He is God's representative on earth. He is, as long as he is in harmony with God, he is he is the son of God, as it were, on earth. We've seen this already. And lest we think that they were confused, when we get down to the rest of this quote, there is a distinction made between the earthly king as God and God in heaven as God. Therefore, God, your God. See, there was no confusion in the psalmist's mind that the God of Israel was the God of, even though you might figuratively call the earthly king God or son of God, the earthly king was not the God, was not Yahweh. Your God anointed you. That everything is in proper relation here. Now, again, I wouldn't refer to any human king as God, but this is the ancient Near East. This was fairly conventional. It is extended language, it is hyperbolic language. The earthly king is not God, but he is like God in some respects. He's the representative of God on earth. So the psalm originally made a distinction between the king as God and God as the king's God. And the king anointed, God anointed the king. And we hear the word here, ekrisen, reminds us of Christ, because Christ means anointed one as well. And so Psalm 45 was originally a wedding psalm that called the earthly king God, not literally, but figuratively. And so when we get here into Hebrews, Hebrews is calling Jesus God in contrast to the angels as servants. Your throne, O God, is forever and ever. Their role is temporary, but Jesus' role as God is forever and ever. And he is a righteous king. And therefore, God has anointed him in the presence of his companions. Who are Jesus' companions? Well, we are. We're going to see when we get to Hebrews chapter 2 that we are the brothers and sisters of Christ. And so, what are the two main points that Hebrews is bringing out? The angels are temporary and they're servants. Jesus is king and he's permanent. They are servants, they bow down. Jesus is king, you bow down to him. And so those, I think, are the main points that the quotation of Psalm 45 have here in the chain of quotes in Hebrews chapter 1. So then we get the second quote, the second quotation from Psalm 102, which is contrasted with what Jesus has said about the angels in verse 7. So the angels, again, what are they? They're servants and they're temporary. And now we have verse 10. And here's the second thing that God says about Jesus. You, Lord, from the beginning founded the earth, and the works of your hands are the skies. So here's finally we get the word Lord, which could be a translation in the author's mind. It could refer to Jesus as Yahweh. I can't say that's not true. It's possible, although there are texts that I don't think necessarily equate Jesus with Yahweh, where he's called Lord. I don't think we should assume that everywhere in the New Testament where Jesus is called Lord, the early Christians thought, Yahweh. I don't think we have evidence really that extra meaning was there in in that many places. There are some places where, like Philippians 2, where I think it is, but that's a rare case where I think it's so clear. But so I think Son of God has to be the name he inherits, because here we are, we're 5 verses away, 6 verses away from where he talked about inheriting the name, and no particular uh, attention is drawn here to the word Lord. Um, Interesting, again, we have Jesus connected with creation. We've seen Jesus connected with creation in verse 2, where it said, through whom also he made the worlds. And I mused last week, I've always puzzled in my mind, is this a very sophisticated metaphor, or is this meant literally? Does Hebrews think of Jesus as very personally there in creation, creating the world? And I noted last week that there are a couple places where God the Father is said to be the creator, in chapter 2, for example, and then in chapter 3, the one who made all things is God, and it seems to be referring to the Father. 11:3, all things were made, by the word of God. No mention of Jesus, and it's not logos. And so, again, I don't feel like we have enough information to say for sure, um, uh, but there's at least a little bit of diversity of creation language throughout Hebrews that could suggest that when Hebrews 1 refers to Jesus as the agent of creation, it's doing something a little bit more subtle and a little bit more figurative, in the sense that God created the world through his wisdom. Proverbs 9, I think it is, or 7 or 9, somewhere in there. And we have, of course, other intertestamental texts and Philo that talk of God creating the world through his wisdom and through his word. And so it's possible, of course, that there's something more sophisticated going on here in referring to Jesus as the creator. Could be referring to him as Jesus is the embodiment of God's wisdom for the creation, Jesus as God's word for the creation. Again, I don't feel like there's enough evidence in the text to say definitively whether language of Jesus in regard to creation is intended literally, or in a very what we might call metonymic way, where Jesus is so closely associated with the meaning of creation that we speak of Jesus as the creator. I don't feel like I have enough information in Hebrews to definitively draw a conclusion, on that question. Both are correct, or both are acceptable theologically. But definitely verse 10 is suggesting that Jesus is the grounding of the creation. The angels are in the creation. The angels are part of the creation. They're like winds and flames. But Jesus grounds the creation. The skies are the works of Jesus' hands. Verse 11, they will perish, but you remain. Again, remember two points of contrast between verse 7. One is Jesus is king, while the angels are servants. The others are that the angels' role is temporary and Jesus' role is permanent. So the creation, which the angels are part of, is temporary. It will perish. The skies, the created skies will perish. As a garment, they will become old. Verse 12, like a wrap, you will roll them up. Like a garment, they shall be changed. But you are the same, and your years will not run out. They will never come to an end. One of the interpretations that I'm known for um, is for seeing the creation in Hebrews as a cut at the dotted line and throw away. This idea that the earthly creation will be removed in 12:27. I've thought a lot about this over the years, and this is an area where, okay, you're hearing it here, maybe for the first time, maybe not. I've changed my mind on that interpretation, mainly because it's simply unattested in the ancient world. I didn't know this when I was doing my doctorate, but there just is no precedent for the idea that the created realm will simply be eliminated, snuffed out to where it no longer exists. I grew up with the idea you die, you go to heaven, and probably didn't have a full understanding of resurrection and new creation at that time. Now, I do think that N.T. Wright has possibly gone a little bit overboard uh, uh, in his um, thoroughgoing new creation theology, as it were. I think there may be some hints of a more dualistic perspective in parts of the New Testament, but nevertheless, I think he is right in the sense that um, the idea that the earthly realm would be removed simply would be unprecedented within Judaism. So I have to believe that even though Hebrews doesn't spell it out, um, there must have been implicit a sense of recreation or new creation. It's just simply the idea of total removal, annihilation of the created world. It just simply is unattested, as far as I can tell, in the ancient world. Um, anyway, someday maybe I'll publish my change of mind there. But clearly, this is the end of the created heavens and earth as we know it. They will be changed. The role of Jesus is permanent, whereas the role and identity of the angels is transitory and temporary. So then we get to verse 13. For to which of the angels has he said at some time, sit at my right hand until I would place your enemies as a footstool for your feet? There's what's called an inclusio between verse 13 and verse 5 here. An inclusio is where you start and end a literary section with very similar words. And that basically says this goes together. We're tying it all up. We're doing the bow tie. And so verse 5 says, to which the angels has he said at some time. And then here, verse 13, to which the angels has he said at some time. It's almost exactly the same quote. And so this is a alert. This chain of quotations is now coming to an end. And so it's a nice little inclusion or bracket, inclusio we call it, beginning and ending. We tie up this chain very, very nicely. And the quote here is Psalm 110:1, which is a very important psalm for the earliest Christians and is a very important psalm in Hebrews. I think it was James Buchanan, not the president, who's, do I have that name right? Anyway, Buchanan, who suggested that Hebrews was a sermon on Psalm 110. I wouldn't go that far, but certainly Psalm 110 looms large in the background of Hebrews. Psalm 110 was, I believe, a psalm that the earliest Christians saw Jesus' resurrection through. They used Psalm 110, I think, to process Jesus' resurrection. And again, this is enthronement, right? Once again, we're at the enthronement. I think the enthronement has been the locus of timing for the entire chain throughout this, because he receives Lord when he sits at God's right hand. He receives Son of God when he sits at God's right hand. He's anointed as Christ at God's right hand. So I think the timing of the entire catena here is the enthronement. And we see it here again. Sit at my right hand until I make your enemies a footstool for your feet. And so we end with the focal enthronement quotation from the Old Testament. Then verse 14 gives us a general sense again of what the role of the angels is. Are they not all ministering spirits, having been sent or being sent to for ministry on account of those who are about to inherit salvation? So the ministry role of the angels in relation to humanity is a temporary role. Once we are restored to what we were supposed to be, once Christ returns, once salvation is accomplished, that role of the angels will come to an end. And this is a good place for us to stop and step back and say, well, why is Hebrews 1 contrasting Jesus with the angels in the first place? And there have been some in the past who've said, well, maybe the audience of Hebrews, maybe they're like the Colossians, maybe they're in danger of worshiping angels, or there's another interpretation of Colossians that they see themselves as worshiping with angels. And so maybe the audience of Hebrews has come unto this kind of Merkavah mysticism where they think they're worshiping with angels. and Hebrews wants to make it clear, you realize that angels are second fiddle. Certainly that idea that the angels are subordinate to Jesus is part of the message of Colossians. And there are some interesting parallels between Colossians and Hebrews in various places. And so Colossians indicates, that you guys think that you're nifty because you have angel cards. Look, I've got Gabriel. Well, I've got Jesus, and Jesus trumps all angel cards. Certainly, Colossians indicates that Jesus is higher than all principalities and powers and angels. And so perhaps some of that's in the water. Perhaps Hebrews 1 is giving us a little bit of a sense that there was in the waters a little bit too high a view of angels, or not a quite enough high enough view of Jesus. So it is possible that somewhere in the back of Hebrews there is an attempt to make sure you don't fall into the Colossian trap. I would say I would put that as number two possibility, and could be possible. A number three possibility that I've not been convinced ever of number three. So I'll mention it, but I don't see it. And that's that some may have thought that Jesus was an angel, and that Hebrews is trying to make it clear, no, Jesus is not an angel. Jesus is greater than the angels. That's never really done anything for me. I can't see it. So I'm going to throw that one away. Admit to the possibility that number two might be somewhere in there. And that's the idea that there were some who maybe didn't have a high enough view of Jesus, or had too high a view of angels. I'll put that in there as a number two somewhere. And the number one option, I think, is that it's clear, especially when we go into chapter 2 next week, we'll see. It's clear that angels were associated with the giving of the law. Chapter 2 of Hebrews will make it clear that angels were associated with the giving of the law to Moses, that angels mediated the giving of the law to Moses. Acts 7, the sermon of Stephen, is very clear in this connection. And then Galatians also, Paul talks about in Galatians 3 about the angels being mediators of the law. And so even though we don't necessarily always think of the angels as being associated with the old covenant, it's fairly clear in the worldview of these New Testament texts that angels were associated with the giving of the law of Moses. And so in that sense, angels are associated as ministers of the first covenant, ministers of the old covenant. And since Jesus is the king in the new covenant, when the king of the new covenant arrives, then the role of the ministers of the old covenant is coming to an end. And so I think that's my number one pick for why Hebrews contrasts Jesus with the angels in chapter 1. And the reason, I believe, is because it's making it clear that the new covenant has come, and that the role that the angels have played, an important role, an honorable role as ministering servants to those about to inherit salvation, well, it's about to come to an end. And so with Jesus arriving, dun, da, 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 he is greater than the angels, he is greater than the angels, and the new covenant has arrived. And that means that the role of the angels is coming to an end, and Jesus has inherited a name that is as much greater than the angels, who are just servants with a temporary role. But Jesus is King, Jesus is Son of God, Jesus is Lord, Jesus is Christ, and his years will never come to an end. Well, this has been Through the Bible in 10 years, Hebrews 1, 5 through 14.